This is a story about two guys doing the absolute most to self-incriminate themselves in a crime they didn't commit. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Today you might notice something different about our video. That difference is that we're in a new place, a new studio, and as you can see by the white wall behind me, that studio is not yet set up. So there's going to be a little bit of echo, there's going to be, not as pretty of a background, but we promise next week we'll be back to normal. And bear with us because this is actually a video that we're redoing because we have to correct ourselves. We got it wrong last time. And by we, I of course mean me. I do the research. This is my fault.
I get pictures wrong sometimes, though, so sorry.
That is true. You do get pictures wrong, and it's always a pretty funny way.
Yeah.
In 2014, a resident of Bozeman, Montana named Aaron Hedges went on a hunting trip with two of his buddies, Joe and Greg, that was not going to go very well for him. The three men were headed up into Montana's Crazy Mountain Range, a land known for being isolated from the Rockies and a stunning natural beauty, as well as a strange checkerboard pattern of federal and private land. There's a strange arrangement there where basically every other square of land belongs to the federal government, while the family ranches that have stood there since the 1800s have managed to remain in private possession. Now, nearby Bozeman in southwestern Montana is home to about 53.3 thousand people according to the 2020 US Census, and sometimes John Mayer. Bozeman is also the seat of Gallatin County, Montana. A common pastime for residents of Gallatin County and the surrounding areas is, of course, hunting. Now, up in the mountains, you can find all sorts of wild game. Deer, elk, basically, whatever you're looking to hunt for meat, you can find it up there. And like many Bozeman natives, Aaron Hedges was an avid hunter. He was a very experienced and skilled outdoorsman, and at the age of 38, he spent most of his weekends up in the mountains or on the prairies looking for wild game. However, despite this very intimate knowledge of the outdoors, especially his local region, Aaron was fated for something unfortunate. And that is the story we're going to be telling today. On September 5th, 2014, Aaron, as well as his friends Joe and Greg, set off on a trip up into the Crazies. Now, the plan was to spend 5 days up in the mountains hunting elk. They really only needed to get 1 or 2 elk to get them through the winter in terms of meat here. You gotta remember how big these animals are. So they planned to arrive and set up camp on Friday, and then on the 10th, which would have been a Wednesday, they were going to pack themselves back out and head home. Now, the Crazies themselves, like I said earlier, are an island mountain range, and they sit about 1 hour and 15 minutes northeast of Bozeman, Montana. They're considerably younger than the Rockies, but they're also very similar to the Northern Rockies, more so than any other mountain ranges. As far as the name goes, the Crazy Mountains, the Crazies, are kind of a strange name for a mountain range when you think about the other ones we have in the United States, the Adirondacks, the Appalachians, the Rockies. The Crazies seem to have gotten their name not from a local Native American tribe or even a physical description of them, but rather from some sort of folklore element back in the 1800s. One version includes a settler family, the Morgans, who arrived in 1846 on their way to Oregon, and their plan was to just stop for a little bit, rest, take a few days, graze their oxen, and then get back onto the trail. And according to the legend, the Morgans stopped their wagon train just southeast of the Crazy Mountains, pretty much in awe of its beauty and its majesty, this giant mountain range in the middle of prairie. After being stopped for a few days, Mr. Morgan, around dinner time, failed to return with the oxen when he was expected, so Mrs. Morgan sent out their 3 kids to look for their father. Soon after, she heard some screaming and went to look, and, bringing an axe with her, found that the Blackfoot Native Americans were actually massacring her family. Mrs. Morgan ended up killing several of the Blackfoot raiders with an axe before running off screaming mad into the mountains. As a result, the mountains were dubbed the Crazy Woman Mountains, and of course she died there after people brought her supplies for a few weeks, but she was basically going insane the whole time. And you may be noticing that story paints the Blackfoot in a rather negative light. Now, I will say this much, they were a pretty warlike tribe. This was the Blackfeet specifically, who were more on the US side of the US-Canadian border, but the story might be influenced in many ways by that sense that the natives were savages and uncivilized. There is another story, and one that I find to be the more likely one, after thinking about it, which involves a Crow chieftain That chief was named Plenty Coups, and it might be Plenty Coops, but the spelling was Coups. And this is a completely different group of Native Americans. Now, you gotta remember that the Blackfeet were an Algonquin group. That is the same as the Secatan and Croatan that we talked about in the Roanoke video, as well as the Ojibwa, from whom we get most of our modern stories of the Wendigo. So we're talking about that same general grouping. The Crow, on the other hand, of whom Chief Plentycoos was the chieftain, they're a Siouan group. So they speak a Sioux language. They're from a different Native American tribal umbrella. You can think about this the same way you might think about, Celtic speakers versus Germanic speakers. Yes, they're both European, but they're not the same. Chief Plentycoos, according to this story, went on a vision quest for 4 days in the Crazies, and what he saw was the coming of the white man, the rise of domesticated cattle instead of buffalo, as well as a few other visions of settler colonialism that would come to pass. Now, of course, when the settlers arrived very soon after this, they spoke to the local Native Americans about, okay, what are those mountains over there? Who lives there? What is that? And due to the language barrier, because they had only recently encountered the Sioux languages, they misunderstood the words for vision quest and, just the understanding of what was going on there for more like hallucinations, which they would have understood not as a way of better understanding the universe, but instead as insanity. So rather than totally grasping the idea of a vision quest, which would have been extremely foreign to Europeans by the 1800s, they simply understood it as crazy and called them the Crazy Mountains. Of course, there's other stories, some of which even include this being where the Native Americans would send their mentally unwell, and thus they became the Mountains of the Crazy People, therefore the Crazy Mountains, but the Chief Plentycoos one seems like it's the most likely. In any case, the 10,000-foot peaks of the Crazy Mountains are a storied place, and they are split privately and federally between private ranchers and Gallatin National Forest. And then legally, jurisdiction is split between the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department and the Park County Sheriff's Department, of course with the involvement of the Forest Service. As far as wildlife goes, the area is home to elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, black bears, a small population of wolves, and according to ranch owner Jack Ryan, there are no grizzlies yet, but they're coming, which is an oddly ominous thing to say. I'm not sure what that means. And if you want to get real conspiratorial, given the region's Algonquin ancestry, perhaps you might find the Wendigo out there. Now, when Aaron and his buddies set off on their trip, the weather in nearby Bozeman was pretty mild, and of course, as you get up into the mountains, it does get colder and weather tends to become a little bit more severe, but there was no expectation that there were going to be huge issues with them getting in and out during their trip. The high was about 70 degrees, the low 33, and a very average 50 for the average temperature. As far as when they left, given that this was included in the Missing 411 documentary, there's a little bit of confusion here. The documentary claims that it was September 3rd, 2014. Now, of course, if you've seen the Missing Enigmas channel video on this, he says it was September 5th. I went back and I looked through the documents. It definitely appears that they left for the mountains on September 5th. Part of the reason for that is that the 5th was a Friday, and Politis says that the 3rd was a Thursday, when in reality it was a Wednesday. So it seems like Missing Enigma has his facts a little bit more straight. Another place where Politis departs from the official Park County narrative, and I'll give him credit for this, he was not given access to that, while Missing Enigma seems to have been. It appears that David Politis, according to my sources in the various departments, was denied access by the department and did not submit a FOIA request, perhaps because he thought that the Sweetgrass County reports would be enough for him to go on. There's another issue, which is that Politis in the documentary claims that they went up Cottonwood Bench Road. That part appears to be correct, but he also says they parked their vehicles at Cottonwood Creek Trailhead. He doesn't necessarily say that's where it was, but what he displays on screen is in fact Cottonwood Creek Trailhead, and that's not correct. I confirmed with the departments involved that they actually set out from the Ibex Trail at Ibex Cabin and then made their way east and then north up Cottonwood Creek Trail to Trespass Trail. And then one final inconsistency on this part of them beginning the trip is that Politis says they had 2 horses and a mule. In reality, they had a single pack horse and a single mule. And according to documents from Park and Sweetgrass County, they were not exactly familiar with how to use pack animals. They had brought them along, but they were having a lot of trouble keeping control of them. Regardless of those issues, the sources do agree that they went north to Trespass Creek and rode a trail somewhere in between the 8,500-foot peak and the 7,000-foot creek location. Then, about 2 miles from where they started their trek, the mule freaked out, dropped a whole bunch of stuff down the hill. They couldn't recover all of it, and it turned out that most of the gear that the mule lost was Aaron's. And with the gear remaining, Aaron was not able to actually put it up on the pack horse or on the mule, and was therefore forced to carry all of his stuff. According to Joe, one of Aaron's friends, from this point on, Aaron was generally pissed off, which is pretty understandable considering that he was being forced to carry all of his gear, while his two friends were able to pack theirs onto the horse. Not wanting Aaron to be without his sleeping bag and tent, which were lost when the mule wrecked, Joe managed to make the trek back to the trailers and grab some blankets, a tarp, and various things to make makeshift tent and sleeping arrangements for Aaron. And for reasons I don't totally understand, that is a detail that David Paulides leaves out of this story. Now, due to the fact that they had to backtrack to grab Aaron's gear, at least his replacement gear, from the trailers, they did spend that night on Trespass Creek, at least according to them. The next morning, they started heading up north, where they crossed over a pass into the Campfire Lake area. And at Campfire Lake is where they actually set up their campsite that they would be going from for the remainder of the trip. Now, some sources suggest that they actually plan to stay at Campfire Lake for a night, Moose Lake for a night, Sunlight Lake for a night, and then head back out. Whatever the case, the plan clearly had to shift because they were no longer on the timeline they expected, and no hunting appears to have actually been done on September the 6th. Instead, after making camp, Greg and Joe decided to go up the mountain to observe with binoculars the area around, see if they could spot any game, any good locations for hunting, and then they would travel back down once they knew what was going on. Aaron, on the other hand, stayed at camp. Upon the return of Greg and Joe, Aaron allegedly told them that this was a terrible spot for elk hunting and that he was unhappy with it and did not want to stay there. And to add on to his stress, Aaron had actually equipped a new sight to his bow and was having a lot of trouble aiming with it. According to Greg, he actually couldn't hit a target at just 10 yards when practicing. Now, Missing Enigma does seem to imply, in my opinion, that this was a mental health related issue. Perhaps he was dealing with something. But when I look at the details, it appears to me more that this is a gear issue and that Aaron hadn't properly sighted in the new sight. Aaron ended up spending the night of the 6th by the fire, fitfully attempting to sleep in his tarp and blankets, and generally failing to do so, which made him even more irritated as the night went on. The next morning, the 7th of September 2014, Joe and Greg managed to make their way out to go hunting around 4:30 a.m., heading up a pass to the west. And around 6:30 a.m., they looked down back at their campsite with their binoculars and saw Aaron moving around. It appears that Aaron had explained to them that he was not interested in going hunting that day. He was not doing well with his situation regarding the lack of a proper sleeping bag and a tent, and that instead he was going to head up to a cache he had hidden up at Sunlight Lake. It also appears that Joe and Greg were involved in setting that cache up and knew its location. He planned on getting a sleeping bag, a tent, and a wood stove so that he would have a little bit more comfort at camp. The cache, of course, being up at Sunlight Lake, was about 7 miles if you were to follow the creek directly, and that's basically a day-long hike if you're making a slow pace. It's reasonable that you could get there and back in a day, but it's definitely a quick pace to do so. You're covering about 14 miles of uneven terrain in a very short period of time. So it would not be unreasonable for them to expect that Aaron planned to stay the night up at Sunlight Lake. And if you're wondering, is this something that Aaron shouldn't have done? Is this a possibility that he was in an altered mental state and that's why he chose to go up to Sunlight Lake? That does not seem to be the circumstance here, according to one of Aaron's friends, a man named Chris Bates, who said, and I quote, "Aaron had good common sense. Aaron wasn't a dummy. He knows the area like the back of his hand. So he should have been able to easily make it up to Sunlight Lake. And if you look at a map, Campfire Lake and Moose Lake, where the primary hunting area are down a single creek from where the fork to Sunlight Lake is. There is the Sweetgrass Creek, which heads down before breaking off into a North Fork and a South Fork. South Fork then breaks off into Middle Fork, but once you reach the main Sunlight Creek, that's the only one there. If you're trying to turn off before you get to that, it's a pretty obvious turnoff. And one thing that Chris noted was that Aaron spent basically every other weekend up in these mountains. He should have known his way around, and it makes very little sense that somebody might make a mistake going through these mountains. As far as gear goes, Aaron was carrying a Badlands backpack, some more clothes, a lighter, a bow, a 4.4 Magnum, water filters, Mountain House meal packets, and his cell phone. So he was pretty well equipped, at least for the day hike. Now, the friends had made arrangements that they would check in with each other at noon and then when it began to get dark. So, around 12:01 p.m., they checked in with Aaron, who replied and confirmed that he was in fact alive. One important detail here is that they were using FRS radios. Now, FRS stands for Family Radio Service, and these specific radios were Garmin Rhino 120s, which, when on the FRS frequencies, have a range of about 2 miles. Another important detail about the Garmin Rhino 120 is that it has a LED screen that in fact shows you, on GPS, where the person you're speaking to is as long as they're within range. The strange part is that Aaron's location does not make sense based on what we're told he said. He said that he believed he was between Moose Lake and the turnoff for Sunlight Lakes, but that he also felt like he had gone about 7 miles. The problem is, the fork is only about 3 to 4 miles from Moose Lake, so he had definitely gone too far. Later that same day, Joe and Greg ended up taking the same route as they searched further for elk. And as previously stated, they told officials they were camping at Campfire Lake, which does, for the most part, sit on Gallatin National Forest public land and is therefore permissible. One strange thing about this is that Aaron, knowing the area so well, should have known the landmarks, and even if rather disoriented by his mental state, he should have known where to turn off. Even if you're having a hard time determining how far you've walked, if you know an area well enough, you're going to be able to recognize what landmarks will tell you where you're going. So he should have known if he was between Moose Lake and the turnoff, or if he was beyond it, and been able to give a more accurate location. His final GPS location showed him just on the edge of the range, and it's believed that he was maybe a couple miles east of that fork by that point. So why didn't he recognize that? Aaron was next contacted by Joe and Greg at about 4:30 p.m., at which point they informed him that they had shot an elk and he should start heading back towards them to help with it. Aaron responded that he was not entirely sure where he was, believed he was numerous miles away from where he was supposed to be, and "I don't think I'll be making it back tonight," were his exact words. Of course, all of this has been relayed to us exclusively through Joe and Greg, who are the only sources that could possibly know what Aaron was saying. One other thing that they told the investigators later on was that Aaron's frequency, not his frequency, but his quality, was significantly lower than it had been when they called him at 12, meaning he was even further away, probably getting to be outside of the search area. And I will say, all of this makes me question the information that these radios only have a range of 2 miles, because that doesn't really line up with anything that I'm reading here. It would imply that they were all within 2 miles of each other the entire time, so I'm not sure exactly what was going on there. Maybe I misunderstood what I was reading. I don't want to come to you guys and give you information as if I'm positive about it, but this is what I understand from the resources I could find. I am no expert on radios. When speaking to police later on, his friends told them that Aaron didn't seem all that excited about the fact that they had shot an elk. And while Joe was considerably more distraught than Greg's response was basically just, he really should have helped us with the elk, which is strange. Most importantly, this would be the last radio contact anyone had with Aaron, and it was on September 7th at 4:30 p.m. After bagging and hanging the meat from the elk because they weren't able to pack it all out that day, apparently the way you do this is that you put it into game bags and hang them to be out of the way of predators, and I guess the game bags hide the scent. I'm not a hunter. They then, at around sundown, headed back to their camp at Campfire Lake, and there they spent the night. Aaron, of course, was somewhere off in the wilderness, and it seems they assumed he was going to be fine. Monday morning, Joe and Greg made their way back up Middle Fork Creek, north of Moose Lake, to the Dead Horse Lakes where they had actually shot their elk. It's important to note that at this point, they did not attempt to contact Aaron, who they had now not actually seen for over 24 hours. They bagged everything up, packed it out, and headed back down to Moose Lakes, where they camped for the night, and then the next day packed their way over to Campfire Lake, stayed one more night, and then made their way out of the mountains on the 10th. At no point during this period did they attempt to contact Aaron, or at least at no point did they attempt to contact Aaron and tell police about it. Upon reaching the trailhead and their vehicles and obtaining cell service, they turned on their phones and received a group text to both of them from Aaron, wherein he said, "I will call you tonight." Greg, claiming he didn't know when the text had been sent because his phone was on airplane mode during the trip, replied, "Don't contact me until you're sober. You should have helped with the elk. Glad you're okay." So why did he mention sobriety? That's an important detail that David Paulides did completely leave out of the documentary, and I do think it's one of the more egregious times that he's omitted a detail. As much as I want to support what he's doing as a pioneer, it does frustrate me when we come along against these circumstances. Aaron was a recovering alcoholic. According to everybody who knew him, he had been prescribed a benzodiazepine to help him with his anxiety when he was going through withdrawal symptoms, and he had been working to wean himself off of alcohol because it was apparently destroying his home life. But what did they mean by sobriety? Did they mean don't contact us until you are completely off of alcohol permanently? Or did they mean he was drinking on the trip, which he was not supposed to be, and he was not sober the whole time, and that was the problem, and they didn't want to hear from him until he was? Was this a sobriety in the sense of the next couple days, or sobriety in the sense of 30 days of AA? As far as sobriety goes, later documents from the investigation do show that Greg and Joe had been drinking on the trip, and bringing alcohol on a trip with a recovering alcoholic does display a sincere lack of judgment on the part of the person doing that. So that's something that needs to be taken into account when thinking about Greg and Joe's behavior. There's also another thing about that text message that doesn't line up, which is when Greg received it. Aaron was able to send the message, according to the phone records, at 8:35 p.m. the night before, Tuesday. Greg had his phone on airplane mode. Was this because he didn't have service, or was this because he was trying to avoid being contacted? And then, of course, there's another question, which is, if Aaron's phone had service and battery on the mountain, why did he not call for help? Did he not realize that he was in danger yet? Anyway, at this point, when they were headed down the mountain and they received this text, Greg decided to call Aaron's wife, Christine, and ask him a strange question, which was not the part where he asked, "Have you heard from Aaron?" but rather, "Is Aaron alive?" Why would he ask that question, and also why would Christine know, all the way back in Bozeman, if Aaron was still alive when even the people just with him didn't know? And then, upon her telling Greg that she hadn't heard from Aaron, Greg had her call search and rescue, instead of calling himself, when he certainly could have led people to the area much quicker. It makes you ask the question, was Sunday really the last time they talked? And either way, why did Greg and Joe not call search and rescue themselves once they had cell reception? If they thought that Aaron not contacting his wife was important enough, then probably Aaron not contacting them was also pretty important. And one of the first things authorities wondered when the investigation began was, why did Greg and Joe not search for Aaron themselves while on the mountain? Why wait to come down and then have somebody else miles and miles away call search and rescue? They knew where he was supposed to be, at Sunlight Lakes, and they also had his last known GPS location. So at the very least, they could have trekked to one of those two to figure out if he was present. The answer they gave was pretty unconvincing because all they said was, everyone had an understanding on this trip that we were leaving Wednesday. That doesn't tell you anything. If everybody had an understanding they were leaving Wednesday, that actually makes it more odd that they not only didn't wait for Aaron or didn't attempt to contact him, but also did not notice that he was not there already and that both of their vehicles were there. They had left one with the keys behind just in case somebody got out first. What happened? So, during their interview, they tried to shift the blame onto Aaron, saying that he had been acting loopy and agitated. But all this says to me, again, is that they should have been concerned for their friend, not irritated with him and ignoring him. In reality, if he was actually that agitated and, combative, then they should never have let him go off alone. He clearly was not in the right state of mind to be hunting. It was also at this point that Greg and Joe told the police of Park County about Aaron's alcohol abuse. This was not something that had been known to investigators beforehand, but he was the type to drink, a pint of Jack Daniels a day, according to Greg. That's an insane amount of alcohol. And as a way to avoid this and avoid the way it was ruining his life, causing him to spiral out of control, a doctor, Lisa Murdoch, prescribed him chlordiazepoxide, which is intended to curb the cravings for alcohol and help deal with the anxiety. Now, as somebody who has been prescribed benzodiazepines in the past, drinking and taking benzodiazepines does not do good things for your mental health. It does not do good things for your judgment. And so the possibility that Aaron was on both of these at the same time is pretty concerning. At the same time, Dr. Murdoch told investigators that had Aaron been taking his prescription as he was supposed to be, then he should have been out of the pills by that point. Typically, a course of chlorodiazepoxide is only intended as a strong starting dose with a week to wean down. As it had been prescribed 2 weeks ago, she figured he should be out of it. And once again, as somebody who has been prescribed these medications, after a week or so, it's typically out of your system. It's not affecting you in any visible ways. As well, Christine Hedges told police that Aaron had been agitated and uncoordinated as a result of his medication, but Lisa Murdoch said that that's not really something the medication causes, and as somebody who has been on it, I can attest it does not. Benzodiazepines are in fact sedatives. They make you less agitated. The fact that Aaron was agitated would suggest either that the benzos weren't working or that he wasn't taking them. A full search was launched the next morning, the 11th, at 7 a.m., including 2 horse teams, one of which was headed north and one of which was headed in from the east. Horse Team 1 consisted of Parks County Sheriff's Corporal Steve Voss and Deputy Levi Nelson, and they had orders to search up Sunlight Creek, then the Sunlight Trail up to Sunlight Lake to see where the cache was and if Aaron was there. Horse Team 2 included DOL agent Jeff Mount and Fish and Wildlife Patrol Warden Chris Corin, and a redacted name volunteer. Now, of course, both teams were unfortunately forced to turn back early and did not reach their destinations because a massive snowstorm had rolled in overnight and blanketed the area with 1 to 2 feet of snow and dropped temperatures into the teens. It simply was not safe for the men or the horses to be out there. So the horse teams were back at base camp by 5 p.m. on the 11th. Meanwhile, a Bell Jet Ranger X407, operated by Mark Taylor, dropped 2 search and rescue members at Sunlight Lake to look for the Sunlight Lake cache. And they went to exact coordinates given to them by Joe and Greg. The problem is, the coordinates that were supposed to be the Sunlight Lake cache were actually about 10 miles away from where they were told they would be. However, it did match the physical description they were given, so they assumed that maybe somebody just made a mistake, landed, searched anyway, and found nothing. To be honest, the report is unclear about whether they searched Sunlight Lake or the coordinates, but it seems like the former is more likely. Aiding the search were 2 military helicopters from Air Force Base Maelstrom that were patrolling up the entire known course that they had actually all taken, as well as Sunlight Lake. However, being up in the mountains, visibility was pretty bad due to a low cloud ceiling, and they couldn't really see much. While all of this was happening, Joe and Greg hiked up to the Sunlight Lake cache themselves, despite being told to stay out of the area. This would suggest that they actually provided incorrect coordinates on purpose so that they could go take a look at the cache themselves. The 2 men spent the night at the cache and appear to have been seen by the helicopters above before heading out at around noon the next day. On that day, the 12th, search and rescue actually did manage to locate the cache, probably by going to precisely where the men were. Later that same day, Joe and Greg were both brought in for an interview, and while Joe seemed pretty distraught at the possibilities about what was going on, Greg was more just irritated, and both men believed that Aaron was probably dead due to the snow conditions and his lack of gear to prepare him for that, especially since by this point they knew he never made it to the Sunlight Lake cache. Joe actually began to cry at one point during the interview, whereas Greg complained about Aaron's alleged lack of preparation, which is an odd sentiment from somebody who may be believing his friend just died. And Greg also mentioned the exact kind of arrows Aaron was using, which were gold tip with 4-inch green and white fletching. All the while, Joe believed that Aaron's disappearance was his fault. I can't confirm exactly when this happened, but I believe it was the same day that search and rescue managed to find an elk carcass which had been dressed in exactly the way described by Greg and Joe. But the elk carcass was not where they said it was. In fact, it was a little bit to the west on private land. What that means is that since their licenses were for public lands, and they didn't ask permission from the owner of the ranch, or at the very least the land there, what this means is that because they did not have licenses for that private land, they were poaching, which is in and of itself illegal. And that could be the reason, and is most likely the reason, for the dishonesty from Greg and Joe over those first few days. They were trying to cover up their poaching activity, and it probably only sunk in on the 11th, when the snowstorm was causing so many problems, that Aaron might be in serious danger. Arriving at the Sunlight Lake cache, the search and rescue members managed to find arrows that did match the ones described as being used by Aaron Hedges, as well as the same kind of arrows used by Greg and Joe. However, they didn't find any of these arrows at either Campfire Lake or Moose Lake, and at Campfire Lake, Greg had mentioned that Aaron was shooting arrows and they were missing and breaking on rocks. So it's a little odd that they found absolutely nothing from any of these broken arrows. maybe they were really good at leave no trace, but still. And then there was the part where their phones were on airplane mode, while Aaron's did not appear to have been. Greg and Joe said that they kept them like that to conserve battery, and so they could take pictures while on their hunt. When asked to see the pictures by the police, they only agreed to show them one, which just showed Greg putting antlers and bones into his pack in no sight of the kill itself, so it couldn't be determined where exactly this image was taken. Joe did allow investigators to look at his text conversation with Aaron in the group chat, but a deputy named Nelson was the only one to get pictures of it, and it appeared that there were further responses below what was reported. When investigators asked to see their GPS transmitters, there were waypoints to be expected. There was a lot of private land that they were not allowed to go on, and it crisscrossed in a very intricate way. So it would have made sense that the men, if they really were intent on staying on public land, would have positioned spots for their GPS to tell them, hey, you're now poaching. Instead, there was nothing there. And on top of this, Joe and Greg were being very vague about where they had actually killed and dressed the elk, which was odd considering they knew the area very, very well. They definitely knew that they killed that elk on private land. At the end of the interview, when asked if they would help further if needed, Greg refused to answer the question, and Joe said he needed to rest because he had been coughing up blood, something that the deputies noted did not happen at all during the interview. Further casting doubt on the story told by Greg and Joe, Deputy Nelson was able to interview a witness who claimed that he had seen all three men on the Trespass Creek Trail at a time they said they were not there. Further contradicting Joe and Greg's story, Deputy Nelson was able to interview a witness who claimed that he had actually seen the three men on a trail at a time they had said they were on a different trail. So it seems that there were just way too many holes in the story Greg and Joe were giving. And it was the opinion of Sergeant Clay Herbst that at this time, Joe and Greg were actively withholding information or giving misinformation regarding their exact whereabouts during the trips, and that their phones and GPS data were important evidence. He was probably saying this so that they could get a warrant to check that data. According to a source very close to the case whom I spoke to, there was a point during the investigation at which basically everyone thought that foul play on the part of Greg and Joe was involved in Aaron's disappearance. It seems likely to me that this was the point in the investigation at which that sentiment was building and possibly even unanimous. Joe had been distraught, Greg seemed cagey, and both men had been dishonest about their whereabouts and activities. It was chalking up to be some case of them covering something up. All anyone knew for certain on September 12, 2014 was that Aaron had gotten lost, he was not in his intended location, and that his last known GPS location had been just east of the Sweetgrass Creek Fork, between Sweetgrass Creek itself, North Fork, and South Fork. On the 16th, Joe was brought back in alone and asked to tell his entire story from beginning to end without interruption, and the police would simply ask him questions afterwards. Officer Greg Todd asked Joe why they didn't search Sunlight Lake themselves. Joe teared up while saying that he had thought that Aaron might have made his way out already, and there was no business searching up there. They should check the end of the trail first. However, at this point, he felt that he had made a mistake. Apparently, in case they were wrong about that, they had left Aaron's slippers as well as some food packets at the Moose Lake camp. But Aaron had never been to the Moose Lake camp as far as any of them knew. By the 17th, they had expanded outside of the initial search area, believing that maybe Aaron headed further east. By this point, teams were working on foot with dogs in tandem in Type 2 style grid searches. A Type 2 grid search is classified as purposeful wandering. It's when you have searchers who are aware of what kind of evidence they should be looking for, not just any disturbance, and they're aligned in a set of lanes, and they just walk forward in concert, and if somebody finds something, they stop. Now, this technique is typically one of last resort. At around 1 p.m., a short way off of the main Sweetgrass Creek Trail, one of the teams located a 75-yard diameter area that was a little bit protected from the elements. And inside of that, they found 2 small campfires about 12 inches in diameter each, as well as a pair of Gore-Tex hunting boots. Due to the weather, they couldn't accurately age the fires to say exactly when they had been lit, but they did find some more evidence, including a blue Camelback, a partially burned carton of American Spirit cigarettes, a water purifier pump, and, of course, as I said, the Wolverine brand Gore-Tex hunting boots. This, of course, narrowed the search area, as they now knew that he had been heading east, but it didn't lead to any other finds. Still, they pushed further along the creek, with lanes along either side of the trail between the creek itself and the foot of the mountains. With search and rescue moving on, it was decided that they would deploy Deputy Dean Duvall and Sergeant Clay Erbst to the scene of those fires to check and see if there were any more things that had been missed by the search and rescue team. But those two did not find anything either. Now, those boots have been mentioned, as well as by me in a previous video, as evidence that Aaron should not have gone much further than that. There was snow on the ground, there was a ton of loose shale, so if he was barefoot, how could he possibly have made it as far as he ended up making it? Well, it turns out that something I did not know, and something that a lot of other people did not know, is that bow hunters will often take off their boots and put on moccasins or sneakers when they are approaching a potential kill. This is to reduce the sound they make so that they can get closer. Of course, hunting with a bow is something you need to do from a lot closer than with a rifle. So what's possible is that Aaron, while in this location, actually spotted an elk or a deer and decided to go after it and swapped his boots for a pair of moccasins or sneakers. And I do have to, at this point in the video, thank Missing Enigma for all of the stuff that he was able to pull together in his video, because it made finding sources that were not available to me much easier. Of course, that wasn't the only source we used for this video, but I've got to give him props. He did a great job with his. With nothing new found after discovering that campsite, they ended up scaling the search back on the 22nd. The severe weather conditions and the lack of any clues just didn't justify the risk to the search and rescue teams. However, by March of 2015, they still hadn't found Aaron. He hadn't shown up anywhere and nobody had located remains. So Greg was called back in for an interview. He reiterated the same story, including the fact that Aaron was drinking while on the trail. However, in the September 12th interview, he had said that he actually didn't know if Aaron had alcohol with him. They had alcohol, but they claimed to be unsure with Aaron. Now, that's probably because had they said, yes, he had alcohol with them, they would have looked like idiots, and had they said, no, he didn't have alcohol with him and then alcohol was found, they would have looked guilty. He even included details about how much Aaron was drinking, which he classified as less than Aaron would usually drink on a 5 to 7 day hunting trip. And this led him to the belief that Aaron was not there necessarily to hunt, but more so to go off on his own to that Sunlight Lake cache and just stay there and wean himself off and go through withdrawal alone in the woods so nobody else had to see him in a weak state. And Greg did at this point express some degree of remorse, saying that he should have forbidden Aaron from going on the trip with him. He should never have allowed that, given Aaron's mental state. He also reiterated the claim that Joe had been coughing up blood all day on the 11th and 12th, but it had been him who insisted that they check the Sunlight Lake cache. Upon arrival, it became very clear to them that Aaron had not been there, and they did not have time to hike out, so they spent a very sleepless night as Greg listened to Joe cough and a military helicopter fly overhead. A very odd detail here is that he claimed that in the morning he had found tracks that he believed were too small to be Aaron's. Aaron was a size 10, so considering most men are around size 10 to 12, if it was significantly smaller, that would have been an easy thing to recognize. Finally, Greg denied any involvement in Aaron's death or any potential cover-up of what happened to him. The next movement on the case was June 19th, 2015, when Chris Rain and his father-in-law were repairing a fence on their ranch, Sweetgrass Ranch, which is of course a dude ranch. They came across a backpack, a bow, and some gear, and with them was an ID, which of course listed Aaron Hedges. Remembering that he had been reported missing the previous year, they contacted the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department, who of course then contacted the Park County Sheriff's Department. Sweetgrass officers headed out the same day, with Park County prepared to assist the next. Now, one of the things that they found amongst that gear was Aaron's 4.4 Magnum. Now, that's of course a revolver, and the weird part is not that they found it, it's that it only had 3 live rounds in it, which suggests that either Aaron brought an only half-loaded revolver into the mountains with him, that he fired 3 shots and didn't reload, or that he ran out of ammunition and was down to his last 3 shots. In any case, all 3 of those possibilities raise questions. Why bring a half-loaded revolver into the mountains? Why not reload your revolver after using it? And finally, what was he shooting at that caused him to run out of ammo? In any of those possibilities, there are numerous questions to be asked, and all of them have strange implications. But there was also one other thing in there, a prescription pill bottle that had prescription drugs in it. Now, it's not listed what those drugs were, but I would venture a guess to say that it was the benzodiazepines that he had been taking to curb his alcohol withdrawal symptoms. and it had pills in it. Now, this meant that he had not finished his course. Was he taking them while in the mountains? Was he taking them while drinking? Again, questions. And if he had been on those benzodiazepines and been drinking while on that trip, it would have severely impaired his judgment. And of course, on top of all of this, the backpack and gear were discovered about 4 miles away from his boots. That doesn't mean that he hiked 4 miles without his boots, but it does suggest that he stalked something a very long distance, or perhaps he was running from something. That distance, by the way, is as the crow flies. It's not actually following any trail. For 12 months, there was no movement on the Aaron Hedges case, until August of 2016. On the 5th, some dudes on a dude ride at a dude ranch, not to be confused with the Blink-182 album Dude Ranch, came across a human skull. Now, the skull itself was actually discovered on the Billy Creek Ranch property, which kind of subdivides the Rains property from their main ranch with the Sweetgrass Dude Ranch down to the south. Anyway, it was not even a mile south of Aaron's belongings. Sweetgrass Ranch in turn notified Sweetgrass County, and Sweetgrass County notified the Park County Department. And at this point, an important thing to note is that Aaron's belongings and his remains were both found well within view of Sweetgrass Ranch. At any point, he could have looked down and seen the ranch there. So why didn't he go to it? Upon the report, Alan Ronneberg, who is now sheriff of Sweetgrass County, as well as Brian Green, then Sheriff Dan Tronrud, and search and rescue member David Tronrud, the son of the sheriff, traveled out to Sweetgrass Ranch, where they were met by landowners Tony Caraccia and Nathan Anderson. They left to get into the mountains around 1 p.m. At around 4:30 p.m., they came across his skull. And that sat on the ground under a fallen tree, while about 40 yards away were the remainder of his remains. Amongst the other remains, they found a mandible, a pelvis, a femur, a humerus, some parts of his spine, metatarsals, and 6 rib bones, as well as his mossy oak pattern Sitka coat, a fleece pullover, his Samsung cell phone, and oddly enough, the waistband of a pair of men's underwear. And what they believed was that the reason that his skull was in a different place from his bones was that it had been buried underground by a bear. Now, as we've mentioned in our video on Bart Schleyer, bears will usually take whatever food they haven't eaten yet from a kill and bury it underground to preserve it and keep it out of the way of other animals. The remains were given to medical examiner Dr. Kurtzman, who was able to confirm that it was Aaron via dental records. And the official cause of death was listed as exposure, which is really all they could say. They had no evidence of injury, but they also had very little evidence of anything. Outside of that, there was never really any further thought to it. The area has kind of forgotten the case. It's not that nobody remembers it, and it does get mentioned here and there, but it's not really a topic of conversation. And this is something we found when we did our Tom Messick documentary. When we went up to Brant Lake, New York, very few people actually knew what we were talking about unless they lived in Brant Lake, New York, and had lived there for a while. And it was pretty much only people who had been involved in or very closely connected to people involved in the search. But one thing that stuck out to me is that by David Paulides' own criteria, this really is not a missing 411 case. 2 of the factors that he says will rule one out are voluntary disappearance and suicidal ideation. According to Aaron's brother Robert, he was worried about Aaron committing suicide. And it also was a voluntary disappearance. Aaron told his friends he was walking off. Compile that with his alcohol abuse issues, and you've got a number of factors that really make this not a missing 411 case. Of course, Paulides was denied access to the Park County records and did not get a FOIA request for them, so it's possible that he just thought the Sweetgrass County ones would be enough, and that, you know what, this was not that big a deal. Unfortunately, those Park County records include a lot of information that's disqualifying here. One thing I do have to chastise Paulides for here, though, is leaving out the issue of alcoholism. Sources tell me that he was very much informed, and it was filmed, and he did leave that out. Now, maybe he thought it wasn't relevant, but I feel like it's up to the audience to decide if that's relevant, not him. And of course, there was the belief that maybe it was foul play, but that was eventually ruled out by just the physical evidence and the location that things were found. As far as anyone could tell, Greg and Joe had never made it to where Aaron was. It's far more likely that Aaron just missed his turnoff, weird as that is, and his friends were trying to cover up their poaching activity, than that they did anything to him. Search and Rescue, of course, believed that maybe had they expanded the search area sooner and considered lost person behavior, some of that irrational decision-making that occurs when you're panicked, they might have found him in time, but even then, There's a strong possibility that he was already experiencing hypothermia by the 11th, and they didn't even get out there until 7 a.m. that day. So a lot of things here are very straightforward, and the only oddities that really stick out to me are, one, Aaron missing his turn, because it's just such an obvious spot. Now, there's of course the possibility he was trying to disappear, but even then, wouldn't he go and get his stuff first and then come back down? Why abandon all of his gear and just hope to survive out in the wild? Of course, maybe it was suicidal, but there's not a ton of evidence for that aside from what his brother said. There's also the fact that he made it to a spot that was in view of Sweetgrass Ranch and then hiked another quarter-mile south of the spot that was in view of Sweetgrass Ranch, all before dying. So, if he reached his destination up at the top of the hill and he could see the ranch, why not go down there? Was he trying to, and that's why his body was found so far from his gear? It seems possible. But then again, if Aaron knew the land so well, and he had his GPS locator, why not just go directly to the ranch? Why go all the way up top of a hill overlooking it instead of just finding safety when he knew where it was? And finally, why hasn't this happened more? If we look at a lot of these other locations like Yosemite, people disappear a lot there. In the Crazies, according to sources from the area, this has only happened once in the last 100 years, aside from Aaron. People just don't go missing up there. It's very easy to navigate, even if you just have a map. The only thing that can be seen as clear here is that Aaron must not have been in a proper mental state. Something must have been seriously clouding his judgment. Maybe it was alcoholism, maybe it was the withdrawal, maybe it was mixing the alcohol with the benzodiazepines, but we also don't know that he actually did that. So we can only make assumptions from it, and those things seem likely. But one other detail sticks out to me that I thought I'd mention, which is the footprints. Why were there smaller footprints than Aaron's in the snow at the Sunlight Lake cache the night after they stayed there? You know, it does very much seem in this case like this was just a simple set of bad decisions. But considering the folklore of the region about, what might live up in those mountains, and the stuff we know that's not super far away in Native American folklore, like the Saskats just a few hundred miles west, I do wonder if maybe he was running from something, at the very least maybe thought that he was being chased, but the footprints are odd. In any case, the paranormal seems less likely to me here. The idea that he was being hunted by feral people seems less likely. There's enough evidence to say Aaron probably was mixing alcohol and benzodiazepines, that he freaked out when he missed his turn, was trying to avoid his friends, was already agitated, and just went off in the wrong direction, making poor decisions because of the drugs that were in his system. Now, again, really hard to make those turns and miss those easy spots to get back to safety, but when you're not in your right mind, sometimes you don't do stuff that makes sense. But of course, I'm sure you guys have opinions. Let us know what you think. I want to give a special thank you to both the Missing Enigmas channel as well as David Politis for bringing this story to attention and, at the very least, trying to explain what happened to an unfortunate man. I'd also like to thank members of the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department for their cooperation and helping me with some of these details. And if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon. You can subscribe for just $1 a month. It helps support us, helps give us consistent, steady income, and helps us make improvements to the show, like the new paneling you're going to see behind me, which will actually be full set pieces. You can also catch us live every Sunday at 7 p.m. for the Lore Lodge podcast. You can catch that on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts as well, every Tuesday after the show. If you want to help support us in a way that also gives you something, then you can, of course, get our merch at thelorelodge.shop, or you can buy our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. The link is in the description. This is not just drop shipping coffee. I actually designed the flavor profile myself, and I have gotten numerous baristas and roasters input on it. They love it. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.